The title, No Time Like the Present, is my attempt to capture something of the relationship between evangelical dissent and time in the Australian context. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, east of Naarm or Melbourne, a place that has been continuously inhabited for at least 40,000 years. The story of the Wurundjeri people is a story of deep time, and this deep time is mystically present in the spirituality of First Nations peoples. Time is not linear, not until the coming of the Europeans in the late 1700s. Historians increasingly understand that Europeans colonised both space and time in the Australian story. Colonisation brought a notion of linear time that, in its teleology, is Eusebian. It moves toward civic power. Even at the ragged edges of separatist dissent, time has a beginning and an end that allows the narratives of empire building, industrial progress, and faith in unceasing anticipation of the millennium to share a trajectory. In the Australian story, they often shared more than teleology. They shared hope. Christianity and nation were wrapped up in each other's hoped-for fulfilment, and this is visible in the historiography of Australian evangelical dissent. The first half of this paper will explore writings of evangelical dissent as they deal with its forward-looking past, its no time like the present past, and its hope for the future. And then how these hopes slide into histories of present loss, present denial, regret, revision. The second part of this paper will take a step back from the strictly linear understanding of time to explore historical fiction in evangelical dissent and how it invites readers to enter the story and dwell in times past, and how fiction reading calls on those practices of faithful imagination that evangelicals have honed in their present, tangible, experiential engagement with ancient scripture. There is a timelessness implicit in that engagement, as if time past can be recovered, touched, imagined into being, and experienced again from the present day. Finally, the paper will consider what historical fiction can do that conventional history writing cannot, and how both these forms of writing the past have implications for evangelical dissent's participation in the colonial project, because that is always core to the Australian story. A few notes about scope. Australian evangelical dissent is a category that few would recognise in Australian religious history, and which might not even recognise itself. It is a Venn diagram of overlapping concerns that leaves Quakers outside of dissent, and Anglicans, Presbyterians, and Lutherans outside of evangelicalism. In the overlapping circles, we find such denominations as Baptists, Churches of Christ, Brethren, some Congregationalists, Methodists, the Salvation Army, among others. It's not an exhaustive list. Dissent defines itself in relation to the state, and evangelicalism does not. But if there is one thing that unites the historiography of these two movements, it is their denominations' concern, sometimes explicit, more often implied, with locating themselves within Australian nationhood, with writing a past that locates them and legitimises them in an Australian present. Their histories are almost always about their belonging within the landscape and the nation. They have undertaken this task on Aboriginal land. The task has not been straightforward. Let me share some images with you. Evangelical dissent came to the colonies with a long backstory of separation from the state. Allegiance to the principles of religious liberty and sola scriptura at the expense of earthly authorities were fundamental to their worldview. But under southern skies, in a colony known for convict incarceration, there was religious freedom. In 1836, a generation and a half after the establishment of the penal colony of New South Wales, the British military governor, Richard Burke, introduced an act to promote the building of churches and chapels and to provide for the maintenance of ministers of religion in New South Wales. The Church Act, as it was known, closed the door on the Church of England's assumption that it might enjoy the exclusive privileges of establishment in this new and ancient land. And it opened government largesse to other churches in the form of building funds. The government matched private contributions up to £1,000 and aided ministry stipends where at least 100 people declared their intention to attend. What does this mean for the historiography of evangelical dissent? Well, the Church Act funded the building of churches and chapels across the colonial landscape. And the history of Australian colonial Christianity is a history of construction in far-flung places, of building the infrastructure of church and posting ministers in one frontier location after another. It is essentially a story of colonial expansion, of claiming the land for God and, tacitly, of wresting it from its inhabitants of over 40,000 years in Naarm, but 60,000 years or more in other places. And whether or not the denominations accepted government funds, because, of course, some dissenters did not want money tainted by the unbaptized, the story of church building across the land was aided by or sanctioned by a secular government. These histories of expansion and construction could not be written without the conviction that the denomination's story in some way reflected the nation's, at least in terms of its reach and its largeness of vision. Dissent's old political theologies around separation and authority receded, leaving personal purity in high relief at the demarcation line between church and world. Even then, personal focus on improvement in the self and in others found a fairly comfortable fit with the nation's modernist belief in progress and the nation's narrative of expansion and productivity. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, histories of Australian evangelical dissent echoed those of the nation. These historical accounts, and they are accounts, they are full of numbers, carry statistics demonstrating growth, charts, lists for proof of progress, most often with an upward trajectory. Their tone of celebration carried across with the data from the denominational periodicals and minutes of meetings that served as primary sources. Reports in periodicals were published with the intention of justifying the continued funding of church expansion programs, especially the building of new chapels and denominational infrastructure. There, the statistics feel like savvy salesmanship. In the histories, the same statistics and reports read like apologetics. The fundraiser's tone is transfigured into purpose for writing about the past. A number of church histories enumerate the rolling out of chapels across the landscape, often reading like heroic tales in which intrepid explorers ventured beyond the frontiers into what seemed to them the void. Preachers and chapel builders progressed the cause of the church across the nation. Some examples. In 1886, the early story of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Victoria by Blamiers and Smith. In 1922, the Salvation Army's Property Souvenir, Australia, A Record of Progress by James Hay. In 1939, Baptists in Victoria, Our First Century by F.J. Wilkin. And in 1903, the most beautiful example, the Jubilee Pictorial History of Churches of Christ in Australasia, an oversized quarto of 424 glossy pages written for a working class denomination more accustomed to cheap newsprint. It was edited by Aaron Burr Maston, an American evangelist resident in Australia who was intent on indigenizing his ministry for the colonial population. Produced 2 years after the colonies federated to become the Commonwealth of Australia, almost every chapel and meeting house, every congregation across the country was pictured. There are portraits of individual ministers and missioners, of Sunday school children wearing jonquils, of elders standing among tree ferns, and of congregations in their Sunday best, standing in the dust with their dogs. If you forget about the dogs for the moment, although they are lovely, and the fact the denomination refused all government subsidies, this is a history of dignity, of scale and importance. It is precisely not how most of the population viewed these strange and austere people. The book offered a correction. Like most church histories, the Jubilee Pictorial History of Churches of Christ in Australasia ostensibly celebrates an anniversary of the denomination, although 1853 is a dubious date, but the All of Australia approach reflects a civic reality. Church publications and institutional structures lined up behind the new nations structure. That is, when the colonies federated, so did the churches. In 1902, a year after federation, 4 strands of Methodism came together. In 1904, the Congregational Union of Australasia formed. The Open Brethren, not inclined toward the establishment of governing bodies, together began a missionary training school in Sydney in 1903. Other denominations got into federalism early. The Churches of Christ held an intercolonial conference in 1889, their first, the same year as Henry Parkes' Tenterfield oration, in which he called for a great national government for all Australians. They began their federal journal, the Australian Christian, in 1898. The Salvation Army published a federal edition of the War Cry from 1897. Evangelical dissent was swept up in the nation's patriotic story of measurable progress. The denominations believed they were building a Christian nation, modern and free. Such modernist thinking would eventually overtake the churches, however, and by mid-century, scholarly Australian historiography was writing of a secular nation, not just in the sense of separation of church and state, as might reasonably be inferred from the decision not to establish a state church, but secular in the sense of godless. Any notion that the colonial government was at least partly concerned with the souls of the people was lost in retrospective cynicism and resentment of the Church Act's bigger project, the promotion of religious observance as a tool to quell immorality and disorder among a convict soldier settler population. In this new account, the decision within the Church Act not to establish a state church was a step on the path toward rational, enlightened liberation from religion. Religious historians counter that this was not the intention of the Church Act, nor, arguably, the effect. While the historiography of evangelical dissent reflected the present concerns of government at federation in 1901, by the end of the century it found itself having to argue that Christianity had any place at all in Australia's past. Published in 2001, Congregationalism in Australia was based on Lindsay Lockley's 1966 thesis, which argued for the denomination's, quote, influence out of proportion to their numbers in the Federation of the Commonwealth of Australia and in the political and civic life of the nation. In 1988, Ian Breward of the Uniting Church, a denomination incorporating Methodism, Presbyterianism and Congregationalism, he wrote, Australia, the most godless place under heaven. The title ends in a question mark, and the book argues for the persistence of Christianity and its influence in Australian life. The book acknowledges the Church's cultural captivity, even as it responds to another cultural and civic occasion. Its publication in 1988 coincided with Australia's bicentenary, also named the Year of Mourning by Indigenous Australians. Breward followed this short book with a longer assessment of the influence and relevance of Christianity, as he called it, in A History of the Australian Churches in 1991. This second book, notable for its data, so many dates and percentages dotted throughout the account, asserted the early influence of Christianity, acknowledged its decline, and called for churches not to accept the secularist myth that religion is merely a private option. The appendix carries 7 graphs charting the decline of religion and, coincidentally, or especially, the proportional decline in Uniting Church affiliation. Breward's 2003 essay on the Uniting Church in Victoria is remarkable for its sadness at decline. In 2006, Baptist historian Ken Manley's 2-volume From Woolloomooloo to Eternity, A History of Australian Baptists, is everywhere concerned with situating the denomination in Australia and connecting its story to that of the nation, but notes in the conclusion that not many Baptists today figure prominently among the movers and shakers of the nation. It's a line built on an assumption that influence and recognition within a Christian nation might have once been possible, but that now it is not. Reputation plays a role in the grief narratives of modern historiography. Most recently, in 2018 and 19, Stuart Piggin and Robert Linder's 2-volume The Fountain of Public Prosperity and Attending to the National Soul, Evangelical Christians in Australian History, argued against evangelicalism's chronic omission from the secularists' history of Australia and put their neglected influence back into the narrative of the nation. It's a squaring up and setting the record straight kind of history. Writing the decline of Christianity does not fit easily with the faith's own teleology. There is resistance. Much contemporary historiography traces the modernist forward-driven eschatology of nation building that evangelical dissent so wholeheartedly embraced in the late 19th century. before protesting and then mourning its overrunning of evangelical faith in the latter part of the 20th. If we were to adopt the vocabulary of modernist historiography for a moment and plot the story of Australian evangelical dissent on a linear graph, we would find the line of empire, nation, and industry joining and rising alongside the line of evangelical dissent in the late 1800s. Then, as those lines proceed into the 20th century, nation and industry would continue up toward their hoped-for future, while evangelical dissent begins to plateau and fall toward an omega they did not see coming, and with much of the church wanting all the while to rejoin the line, and other parts of the church willing, if necessary, to travel backwards and thus upwards to get there, despite the inherent contradiction. While historians have written many pages mourning and protesting the diverging of the lines, some are increasingly questioning the parallelism. Post-colonial mission histories proliferate, most by historians working outside the church's institutions, beyond its self-preservatory resistance to critique. But I want to question the wholehearted embrace of a linear sense of time by focusing on an almost completely overlooked aspect of evangelical dissent's historiography. Historical fiction self-consciously created a mythic past of time-honoured presence in the Australian landscape. It is an essentially colonialist move, one that mythically occupies the land since the ages, but also one which has deep roots in evangelical dissent's own sense that the ancient past can be experienced in the present, as if there is no time between ourselves and Jesus, between here and Calvary. Holy Land pilgrims on late 19th century package tours imagined themselves walking with Jesus, the earth beneath them providing some kind of divine immediacy accessed through the soles of their feet. Methodist revivalists exhorted 19th century listeners to do more than hear the word. They should imagine themselves living within the text, engaging all the senses, feeling the anger of the mob, smelling the evening breeze at Gethsemane, and watching Christ in the garden. This is, in essence, resurrection faith, faith in which disciples in every age are in equal temporal relationship to the resurrected Jesus. This reading of Scripture transferred easily to the prayerful immediacy of religious fiction. This time-transcending imaginative practice complemented novel readings' own invitation to inhabit the world of the text. Before historical fiction, evangelicals were committed readers of time past. They read the Bible and they read it privately and individually, but within the boundaries of communally prescribed interpretation, within the church's particular moral worldview. Novels invited readers to enter sympathetically into the lives of their characters, to travel with them, to interpret the text without prescription. Responding to the moral dangers of fiction's interpretive indeterminacy, church leaders diverted readers toward morally uplifting novels, especially those written by ministers and their family members. In the UK, the works of the Hocking siblings, Joseph, Silas, and Salome Hocking. In the US, Edward Eggleston, Cora Harris. In Canada, Ralph Connor. And in Australia, George Sargent, T.H. Scambler, Edna Ruffley, Phyllis Somerville, Maud Genet Frank, and George Warren Payne. These historical novelists could do something that historians could not. Historians are committed to demonstrating change over time. Novels allowed readers to experience, in the present, a mythic Australian past, as if it had always been. The first task of myth-making in evangelical historical fiction was to erase another past. Stories of 19th century missioners and circuit riders write over the deep time story of First Nations peoples with eulogies that naturalise white colonisation. Even as readers entered the text's time-honoured past, they lived within a teleological conception of the mythic landscape as due inheritance. White possession was inevitable and enduring. An example, in the fictional settlement of Black Creek, the setting for George Sargent's 1915 adventure romance, The Sweetheart of the Bush, First Peoples are present only in their absence. The narrator makes testimony to their passing. Before the white man invaded these lands, black tribes traversed its shores and roamed through its bush in happy possession. He takes a moral tone and he attributes the blame of invasion, albeit without confession. But what's done is done, and all that remains are the scars on the iron barks from spear making and a stone hatchet in the forest debris. The people have left without their tools and will not be returning. Black people are gone from Black Creek, so the story can take place. This false extinction narrative makes space for Sargent's thinly disguised own personal history. George Sargent's protagonist is Gordon Sterling, a missioner who shares his initials, his physique, and his life story. The Back Blocks Parson is another semi-autobiographical work by a Methodist missioner, the Reverend George Warren Payne, who wrote as Tom Bluegum. Eucalyptus saligna. It's a name that roots the writer in the Australian soil. His protagonist, George Watkins, again sharing the author's first name and initial, expresses interest in ministry to Indigenous men, but then, quickly, inexplicably, in the space of a line or two, he resolves that my work must lie at present mostly among the white population. The territory of the novel's pioneering ministry is thus marked out, and after page 34, Indigenous presence is made invisible. Evangelical fiction, like colonial fiction generally, erased the Australian Indigenous past and present, clearing the land for its own myth-making. The second task of evangelical historical fiction was to enter a shared story. Australia has no shared foundational religious story. There were no pilgrims, little in the way of promised land, no unifying ecclesiastical history of the people. There were plenty of separate and separating denominational origin stories. On Eora lands, Baptists begin with accounts of baptism in the open air as a witness to passers-by and to readers of doctrinally defining denominational histories. Churches of Christ on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung lands and Salvation Army on Nipaluna land begin in tents. And while this is a common story of building shortage during the gold rush population boom, there's more than a touch of tabernacle in the wilderness about worship under canvas. Even when stories overlapped, as many did, sharing a historical narrative was not in the interests of denominational rivalry and ecclesial boundary marking. Sharing a historical narrative was, however, in the interests of evangelical novelists who linked their stories to bigger colonial and then national myths that were fast developing, and not just for the purposes of marketing, but for the making of Australian identity. In the historical adventure and romance of evangelical dissent, ministers are unfailingly heroic. They are archetypal Australian heroes in archetypal Australian settings. They preach a little. They ride horses through bushfires quite a lot. Bushfire was a sure way to locate a story as Australian, and a great many adventure stories feature fire. Reading from The Sweetheart of the Bush, it says, Gordon Sterling galloped away regardless of danger, amid fire above him, fire below him, and fire around him. Trees were crashing and fire showering about him from those burning overhead. In Tom Bluegum's The Kangaroo Flat Revival, a young man called Harry, on the verge of conversion that would lead to a life in ministry, rode toward the fire that threatened the town. The story reads, in a few moments, the roar of flames swept up from the dense foliage in the gully on his right. Blinding, stifling smoke rolled around him, and crackling flames crept and leapt menacingly at him from the roadside. Harry, on the road to Kangaroo Flat, is like Paul on the road to Damascus. In Edna Ruffley's 1942 children's novel, The Lost Road, her 12-year-old hero fills the role of minister, and he rescues a lame boy from approaching fire. We'll make it, John gasped. He stumbled and almost fell, and the fright the stumble gave him was replaced by an almost superhuman strength. The bush was a sheet of flame. Young John dodges a falling branch, but in the other two stories, the adult heroes are knocked unconscious in the fire. Then they are rescued, and then they are redeemed. This redemption is not only a saving from sin, but a recognition as firstborn. In Exodus 13:12-15, after the people come to a land of their own, every firstborn male among your children you shall redeem. Redeemed, reborn into the landscape these men truly belonged. In Australian literature, the bush and the outback are redemptive spaces. And as literary scholars point out, the motif of hero redeemed through encounter with the landscape is used to the point of parody. The extremes of climate and terrain deliver rites of passage through which heroes are made and men are born. Aboriginal land becomes white man's birthright. In Australian literature generally, the myth of colonial heroism in a hostile land works rhetorically to assert enduring ownership. For the historical fiction of evangelical dissent, it indigenizes faith. Significant early Australian literature depicts clergy as self-interested, out of touch with the needs of the people, moralising, ill-equipped for the demands of the climate. There is an argument to be made against the ubiquity of this interpretation, but writers renowned for iconic representation of Australian character, men such as Banjo Paterson and Henry Lawson, describe clergy as profoundly out of place in the Australian landscape. I've written in the past that this rhetoric reflects a loss of faith in providence as if the old country's cool climate religion was little practical use against the extremes of drought and flood in the merciless Australian landscape. But now I think that it is an emasculating move that turns anger at an impotent God onto the representatives of faith. And it defines the kind of heroic masculinity that rightfully inherits the land against another type of manhood that does not. Not every man can be a firstborn. Despite the so-called egalitarianism of Australian society depicted in its literature, the construction of masculinity depends on the identification of less deserving moral others, effete clergy, Indigenous men, women. The heroic novels of evangelical dissent assert that clergy are every bit as rugged and deserving, every bit as masculine, and so evangelical dissent is redeemed in the landscape in ways that conventional historical narrative could not easily achieve. Conventional historical narratives need to work hard to prove their clergy heroic and truly Australian, and even then, they are unlikely to reach beyond a church readership. Novels met a wider audience who could experience evangelical dissent's mythic Australian belonging through their masculine, clerical Australian heroes. Just as the portrayal of Australian masculinity depends on the identification of less deserving moral others, evangelical masculinity is defined in terms of less masculine others. Tom Bluegum's Backblocks parson is, reportedly, no effeminate weakling, but manly, robust, a sun-browned, bony product of the times and climate. He is contrasted with city parsons, Bluegum joining other Australian writers in denigrating clergy who do not truly belong in the bush. He writes, "The parson of the backblocks is a distinct species of the genus Ecclesiastical, and notes the difference between city and country parsons remains definite and remarkable." In contrast, Sargent's city-born hero of The Sweetheart of the Bush proves his manly practical ability in the opening pages, and then, on the basis of physique alone, is assessed by the congregation as well fitted to meet the rough and tumble of the bush life. Like Bluegum's hero, he is bone and muscle. And while both authors describe their missionary heroes as emotionally tender and compassionate, this is a studied counterpoint to naturally hard physicality. As the Baptist preacher and writer Frank Boreham pointed out in a 1927 essay, appealing to men's emotion was essential to their conversion. Women also provide a counterpoint to heroic masculinity. Baptist novelist Matilda Evans, who wrote as Maud Shanae Frank, often depicted strong women in leadership, in leading roles in her novels. In her 1885 short story, Underneath, the women saved themselves from fire in outback South Australia, while the absent men's physiques went without remark. Evangelical dissent borrows and adapts late colonial Australian masculinity, including the necessity to define real men in relation to others, in order to situate itself in the myth of a time-honoured past. By the 1940s, the project of sharing a national story and of indigenising the faith was well established. In Big Enough for God, by Churches of Christ minister T.H. Scambler, the young minister and hero is described as having twice been sports champion in his college. It is all that is needed to reassure readers of his masculinity. Finally, there is a sense in which Australian fiction and evangelical fiction each served a national purpose. Stories of individuals in the landscape established the nation's character and the determination to build a nation in spite of hardship. So although colonial narratives were written as if in a distant past that always was, they participated in a nation-building narrative, an essentially modernist account of progression out of ages past in this land they truly own. This is ultimately a secularizing story, and this secularizing force is clearly visible in the work of Methodist writer Phyllis Somerville. Her novel, Not Only in Stone, was written for the 1936 centenary of the state of South Australia, a civic, secular anniversary. Her story is based on the lives of her own forebears, Cornish Methodist miners who came to the town of Moonta. It is a Methodist story. The people are devout, at least at first, and their story is told not only in their gravestones, in the stony ground of Wallaroo, but in their Methodist hearts. When the story's hero, Polly, first arrives in South Australia from Cornwall, she takes up her work in the church as if it had never been interrupted by a change of scene. Over her lifetime, however, Polly leaves the church behind. Her plucky self-reliance sees her grow in material comfort. She does not look back. There be no good done by going over again what be past and gone. Somerville wrote a story of the state's progress, and she did not need to answer to the church and its mission programs. So in 1936, she could tell a history of secularization that no contemporary church historian could write. It would be some decades before the historians of evangelical dissent would write about their decline and irrelevance to the Australian experience in any way approaching Somerville's 1936 novel. Now, at the end, we have come full circle in a discussion of linear time. The inhabitation of stories in which time past folds into time present is an inheritance of evangelical dissent's experiential biblical imagination. But historical fiction's myths of the ages ultimately serve agendas of progress. These narratives erase another past, a deep time past, in their eagerness to join in a story of Australian belonging. The historiography of Australian dissent coupled itself to that of an industrialising nation, a nation that increasingly told a story of secularisation. Having aligned with modernist values that stripped and eroded religious imagination, now evangelical dissent writes histories that regret its loss of recognition and rue forgetfulness. The task is not straightforward.